Hello everyone and welcome to the last part of the Desert Rats DLC for Unity of Command 2, covering everything past Crusader and including all of those last, sometimes really tough missions from Conference 8. And by tough, I mean obviously Firebrand and Brimstone, which is easily the most difficult mission in the entire DLC, which otherwise is relatively easy. Beyond this and second Alamein, you're probably not gonna have too much trouble dealing with this section of the expansion, especially since Lancer is pretty much the entirety of the historic branch of Desert Rats. And since Firebrand and Brimstone is a bit of a tricky mission, I have prepared a full playthrough video of it on my second channel, in addition to the Crusader playthrough that I published some time ago. Also, as usual with this DLC, I've jotted down all of the cards that you get in the 3 remaining conferences, even though if you really need to see what cards a particular mission offers you with its objectives, you can actually check that out in the scenario editor. And so, I've completed the Desert Rats DLC, on hard, obviously. What is my verdict? What are my thoughts? And it would be really surprising if I said that I hated it, especially since I really enjoyed it, and it's something you should look forward to if you like Unity of Command 2, and you're into the North African / East African / Mediterranean theater. In fact, this is one of the bigger points in favor of this expansion. You're actually going into parts of the war that get less coverage, like East Africa. You have a mission in Syria, which is thoroughly enjoyable. Do you ever get many chances to play against Vichy France in these kinds of games, for example? Or leading the Greeks as your main force and not as a dinky cannon fodder ally. I also really like the allied perspective on this theater because of the, well, more prevalent desert fox, wereaboo interest in this theater. I also actually like it, and this is also about variety, that a lot of the fights you do here is against Italians, not the Germans. And while the Germans bring the nastiest units, it's the Italians that do most of the work defending the front line and actually bring some really nice units themselves, especially by the time of Crusade and Second Alamein. You get to fight some formidable Italian motorized units with lots of specialist depths. Another plus that I'd like to mention is the new approach or new approaches to the way the scenarios were designed. Partly because of the theater, you see maps that are largely empty and that you have to fight against supply problems and the speed of your units to achieve all of your objectives rather than purely military combat resistance of the enemy. You get things like ports that activate if you take them, which reflects the British dominance of the seas and works actually nicely towards better immersion. There is also this designer side insistence on using truck cards to give motor pool to all of the units of a particular HQ for the entire mission, and the incredible value of recon specialists, which are abundant, cheap, have nice stats, die before anything else, except engineers obviously, and enable recon and force in normal infantry. All of this is vital in a theater where reinforcements are really expensive, and in a lot of cases, defenses rely on zones of control. And it's been one of the great things that Desert Rats have done to my own personal playing. I have played a little bit of the base campaign since this DLC, and I've never seen so many recon steps in my units before. And this kind of reveals a very successful approach to design, as Desert Rats does not add anything new to the system except for a couple of new types of terrain, like ridges and escarpments. The game still has everything it used to have, and the DLC still adds variety and changes your game meta. Ironically, theater and variety are also elements that I would like to criticize in this DLC, since especially in later conferences, some of the missions become a bit same-ish. I mean, Battle Axe and Crusader happen in the same place, and I actually recommend not playing both the historic and alternative branches in the last two conferences of the DLC in quick succession because, as I've mentioned, Lancer is a bit same-ish compared to the historical branch. This is obviously a limitation of the theatre in general, and so is another of my minuses, and it's the lack of epic. After Barbarossa, after Moscow 41, after even Stalingrad, we've been treated to all of these huge apocalyptic events, and now we have to deal with smaller scale battles, if not in terms of the land mass, certainly in terms of the army sizes involved. This is probably why my favorite scenario in this campaign is Second El Alamein, where you have a tightly packed stretch of front line and evenly matched enemies duking it out and trying to get the upper hand. And I think it's about time we talked about how to actually win in that scenario. Right, the play war is over and we are finally getting to our actual divisions in El Alamein, and as you may guess from the map if you haven't tried the mission yet, this is not going to be a crazy dash across Ethiopia or something. You're gonna grab a meter of sandy soil every day and be happy about it. That's right, those German and Italian troops are not gonna just let you through. They will attack aggressively, but thankfully, with all of the lessons we've learned in Battle Axe and Crusader, rearguard is the key to this puzzle. So on turn 1, focus your attacks on the 3 hexes between Devil's Gardens and Miteria Ridge. Capturing 2 of those is pretty good. Make sure one of them is Miteria, because it is not a hold objective and you will not have to worry about it any longer. Do not, and I repeat, do not press past these 3 hexes. The Axis have plenty of forces to encircle and pulverize any units that break through. The same actually applies to turn 2, because your goal in the first 2 turns of this mission is to deal as much damage to the enemy motorized units and their capability to counterattack as possible. So keep your tanks in those initial hexes, give them rear guard, and if you have CP left, give rear guard even to the units that stand behind those tanks. The Axis might be tempted to push past the fortified line, and if you do manage to lure them in, so much the better. On turns 2 and 3, your targets will be Kidney Ridge, Devil's Gardens, and Skinflint, and if you manage to destroy a significant amount of German and Italian motorized troops, you will be able to shift your gear a little and give the tanks guarding your newly acquired objectives counterattack ability to scare off any would-be counterattackers. If the Axis troops still look a little too scary and capable of counterattacking, use the old and tested technique of taking hexes around the objectives and filling them with rearguard troops, even though a zone of control around the objective will create a pretty significant barrier to counterattackers trying to swarm the objective. Now, once everything east of Eldaba is secure, do the Blitzkrieg thing, you've earned it. Push your tanks past Eldaba and block the railway. You'll probably have plenty of time to starve out the defenders in and around Eldaba, and you'll need around 2 decent units to dispatch the defenders at Mersa Matruh. One final point, this mission is a bit longer than it strictly needs to be, so use this time to strip all of the units you're not gonna see again of all of their reinforcements and specialist steps, and you're probably never gonna need to buy anything in the rest of the campaign again. Oh, so you've decided to play it safe, Monty? Wrong. El Agheila is one of the more annoying missions of this DLC, despite its apparent simplicity, so if you want to get it 100%, you should expect to restart it a few times. The tricky part here comes from the fact that the Germans and Italians have a fair bit of troops comparable to yours, and it's gonna take a fair bit of tricky outflanking to actually destroy them convincingly and on time. So on turn 1, use a truck card to give all of your infantry motorization and push all of your southern guys towards City Tabet and Marada Track. In the north, use that rear guard order on the Panzer to squeeze your infantry in, once again pushing towards City Tabat. It's actually a very critical town here. Give the infantry that broke through the rear guard order, because the Germans will inevitably counterattack, and you do not want any significant losses here. But establishing a foothold near City Tabat is kind of required for turn 1. On turn 2, you must clear City Tabat and connect your northern and southern forces so that 1, you can bring your HQ closer to business, 2, the supply situation is slightly easier in the south, and you can bring that motorized division towards Marada. You may use one of your New Zealand infantry divisions to clear Marada, but that motorized division will be in charge of taking those distant objectives, i.e. Zella and Sokna. All it takes is just a little bit of trickery with supplies, not too much, so not worth discussing here. The north is much more interesting though, and the main idea for what you should do starting turn 2 is pushing your tank divisions unopposed through the plain south of Agheila, through Dolanuf and Raslanuf. The main objective here is to cut the enemy supply. Don't rush taking Agheila proper, try to create some sort of a perimeter around it, so that the enemy has to dedicate more troops to that area instead of counterattacking at Dolanuf. As for your tanks, don't worry too much about supply, try to secure those western objectives, and obviously follow that pincer maneuver with your motorized New Zealand infantry, which will help out repelling those German and Italian counterattackers, which might at one point retake Dolanuf, but the deadline for this objective is lax enough for you to retake it. And once the supplies start running out, El Agheila objective is not going to be too difficult to take on time. In fact, it's one of the easier parts of the mission. It's actually kind of tempting to get bogged down around Dolanuf and El Agheila and trying to kill all the access units, forgetting that these western objectives, i.e. Notfilia and Bir al-Merduma, are on the outer edge of your own supplies, so make sure you take them out first. After the shaky success with our little pincer maneuver at El Agheila, Tripoli is where we get our just desserts for being daring with mechanized warfare. This mission being a straightforward exercise in blitzkrieg, most of your objectives will not require head-on attacks, as you will push past your enemies, blocking their supply lines and taking them hungry and not very eager to fight. The only exception I've found is the Faskia objective in the south, and as you can see, there is a tank unit with a counterattack order there, so use your recon and force ability to breach one of the hexes next to it and then shuffle in, shuffle out, feint attacks, because the counterattack order goes away in weak units, and then just kill the Italian tank division because it's not a particularly powerful unit, followed by a breach towards and through Faskia, and this breakthrough will pretty much determine your mid-mission activities as you'll rush northwards past any remaining defenders at Al-Gidaya, taking Beni Udid and Wadi Sofegin as you can. Use your best judgment here and bring your HQs closer to business as soon as possible. The supply situation is not going to be crazy here, but you will have to rely on emergency supply abilities. Your next milestones here will be to rush towards the coast between Homs and Misurata, obviously to block the railway and make Misurata an easier objective. It's also a good idea to send some of your infantry along the coast towards Misurata, clearing any defenders and ultimately using these guys to take the town. The other milestone, even more important one, is breaking through to Tripoli. As you take it, it will become a source of supply for you, a great boon, and will be the ultimate destruction of the enemy supply, especially in Homs, which will probably be the last objective you take. It can be a little bit tricky to deal with without too much preparation. Tarhuna is the obvious path towards Tripoli, and I've found that if you're fast enough, in the southeast, the AI tends to send that motorized division that guards Tarhuna to defend Beni Ulid, which ironically is a much less defensible position, as you'll encounter no difficulty destroying this motorized division and having the way open towards Tripoli. And bringing us a full circle back to the beginning of the original campaign of Unity of Command 2 to Wadi Akarit, offers us one final encirclement on the way to success in this historic branch of the campaign. And like Tripoli, it's not a mission that's gonna make you tear your hair out of frustration. One, obviously, this is the last mission in the campaign, so use all of your cards as necessary. It's actually a pretty good idea to have kept that naval bombardment card from Compass 1 and use a truck card to give one of your HQs permanent motor pool for the mission. And the candidate for that, obviously, is the New Zealand Corps, as it will push through Wilder's Gap along with the tanks of the 10th Corps. And so as you try to outflank the enemy defenses in the mountains and push towards Matmata Hills, the Germans will counterattack, as those two German panzer divisions will be pretty aggressive, pursuing that particular task, so it's kind of convenient to have your infantry very close to your tanks, because they'll do well aggroing the enemy panzers, while your own tank and motorized divisions go past these counterattackers and rush towards Kibili and do a pincer maneuver around Matmata Hills. You're probably not going to be able to take it without any preparation. And from this you can already guess what the general plan is, and it is to encircle all of the enemy troops south and southeast of Babić. So now let's look at what the 30th Corps has to do in order to achieve that. Spend turn 1 and 2 clearing that coastal hex next to Mareth, and then taking Mareth itself. The defenders there might appear a bit daunting and well fortified, so make sure to equip your infantry there with lots of artillery and engineer specialists, as I have done, as you can see. Engineers and set-piece attacks will do wonders against these defenders, leaving no stone unturned. Let's just hope Mareth doesn't turn into ruin too early. In any case, the AI is not particularly interested in retaking that objective, and keeping a decently strong unit there will ensure that it's safe. Once Mareth is yours, push further along the coast and connect with the New Zealanders and the 10th Corps behind Matmata Hills. Be a bit more judicious about who you send there and what kinds of orders you give them, because unlike Mareth, the AI is said to be more zealous defending these hexes, and those elite panzers can make very quick work of almost any of your units. So in general, don't expect that encirclement to be very stable. The point here is to deprive most of the enemy of supply for one turn, tipping the scale just a little, and making it easier for you to destroy the enemy motorized and mechanized units, and preventing the enemy from forming any reasonable defensive line around Breach, Wadi Akarit, and Babić objectives. Once those panzers are dead or useless to the Axis forces, the two remaining objectives should not be that much of a problem. Babić might, but that's what you have naval bombardment for. Good luck. So the alternative history branch is about us not waiting too long after El Alamein and just pushing forward along the North Africa coast. And the first mission in this branch, Lancer, is very much that. It is almost exactly a combination of the Agheila, Tripoli, and Pugilist missions. 3 battles in just one fairly easy and chunky package. Let's start with the obvious. Send one motorized division to take Zela and Sokna. You don't need any units to rush past Marada. As you can see, the defenders of the objectives are pathetic, but do kill those defenders of Marada eventually, because if left alive, they love to block your supply lines at the beginning of the map. As for the rest of your troops, just push quickly along the coast. Nophelia airfield is a little tricky sometimes, so focus all of your attention on it first, but once it's done, do the blitzkrieg thing. Your tanks don't fight, your infantry does. The supply situation in this mission is not as bad as the briefing warns you. You will take Sirte very quickly, and with a level 4 or 5 supply hub there, you won't have to worry about supply up until Tripoli, which is another port. So with your tanks, bypass any difficult fighting, any fighting that doesn't promise an overrun, focusing on Benulid, and just like in the Tripoli mission, just go around the defensive line at Homs and take the empty Tripoli. In my experience, Misurata tends to be empty as well, so really don't expect your tanks to face any serious combat here. And once it's cut off from the supply, the defensive line at Homs will become an excellent experience mine for your infantry, because your tanks are not getting any respite. Breach Wadi Akarit has potential to be the trickiest objective of this mission. You simply might run out of time taking it, so make sure none of your tanks stop anywhere near Tripoli. Be quick setting up a new supply hub around Ben Girdan, and obviously bring the HQs to the western parts of the map so that they can support your tanks. And as you approach Breach Wadi Akarit itself, remember that Gebis in this mission is not an objective, meaning that you can use recon in force, or maybe trying to weaken the defenders in Gebis to force through their zone of control without attacking Gebis and taking that last objective. As I've mentioned, this mission is also a good time to get some experience killing the remaining enemies, and perhaps reshuffling some of those specialist steps as well. That's right, this is our reward for being good little Munchsteins and pushing our advantage properly. Catalyst is effectively a combination of the first two missions in the main campaign of this game, i.e. Wadi Akarit and Tunis, except that the Americans are slightly more worthless. Thankfully, this is not a particularly difficult map, and it allows for a lot of latitude, with this one little trick that you need to keep in mind. So use all of the units of your British 5th Corps to push towards Bizerta. Even and especially those tanks and motorized units stationed near Le Kef, push them all north towards the coast and then inch your way along the sea and take that town. The Germans will not be very passive here, but they will not cross the river, and the worst you can expect is that nasty Panzer Division counterattacking it and maybe killing some of your troops, but you're not going to see most of them again. So don't worry about the losses too much. The same applies to the actual taking of the town. Be loss tolerant and, well, if the situation is good enough, open the way towards Tunis. With some luck, it can become the secondary push towards the main objective. But the main takeaway here is that neither the US 2nd Corps nor the British forces in the south will be able to reach Bizerta and take it within the time you've been allotted, so the 5th Corps will have to do that job. Beyond that is mostly modified Wadi Akarit scenario. Breakthrough with your experienced British troops in the south. Watch out for those initial counterattack badges on the enemy tanks, and remember that weak units will lose those badges. But once you break through, do the mad dash towards Fakus and Susa. You might allocate some troops to help out the Americans at Sitibo Zid, but your main objective here is to reach Tunis as quickly as possible, because the rivers south of the town will cause problems, especially if you're like me, did not get your HQs any bridging ability. So it's a good idea to reach the town early and deal with any logistical problems that you might encounter. As for the American troops, boy oh boy, oh boy, all of them are green, god. You do get plenty of troops to take both Kasserine and Sidi Bouzid, but I urge you to look at the units that will stay with you for the last remaining mission, which we're going to talk about soon, and in particular those tank units. They will be vital in the next mission, and make sure that they are not green by the end of this one, that they still have some specialist steps, and do not consist of just one measly step barely surviving there. Otherwise, use your infantry and artillery to breach the enemy defenses around Kasserine, look for openings, and probably try to block their supply lines, and ultimately you'll succeed here. This is not a difficult part of the mission. And the reward for a daring push through North Africa is perhaps the hardest mission in this whole DLC. Firebrand Brimstone is this bigger bastard brother of Husky that will cause you a lot of trouble, but thankfully there are a few ways you can make it better. For one, this is one of the last missions of the DLC, so feel free to use up all of your naval bombardment cards you've been saving throughout this campaign, and as you can see, you will need a lot of naval bombardment to support you in your original landings. Just make sure you keep one or two, because you will definitely need one at Bastia, and perhaps at Olbia as well. And speaking of the initial landings, my rule is to cover as many landing sites on turn 1 as possible. The reason being not just having more troops on the ground, but also having more HQs on the islands, meaning that in general you can spend more points doing specialized attacks and all of the other specialized stuff that HQs do. On Corsica, it is a no-brainer, and you have to take Ajaccio and Calvi airfields on turn 1. This is going to be a slightly more finicky, perhaps annoying part of this mission, so focus on it first and then go to Sardinia. And if this means that only 2 of the landing spots will be covered on turn 1, land at the south, which will be your main push towards Cagliari and then northwards on the island, and land at Porto Conte, more to create a distraction for the enemy motorized forces there than anything else. This area becomes more important later. Gulf of Oristano feels very inviting, but it's not that critical, and the Germans obviously will counterattack and will respond to your landings. There is a tendency for the enemy to push Gulf of Oristano hard, meaning that you might lose a division in your HQ there, so it can wait for the second turn. Also, don't be too bold with your British paratroopers. You will not be able to effectively use them to cripple enemy supply, and enemy tanks have a hard-on for these paratroopers. They will rush to kill them first, and given that paratroopers are better than your normal infantry, it's better to give them secondary targets at first, and then equip them with specialist steps, and then push them to take Cagliari and other difficult spots on your front lines. Alright, so now that our initial positioning is clear, let's look at what we do next in Corsica. Obviously, do not try to push through the mountains that are going to be pretty effectively defended. And Bastia, which is a very annoying objective, will have to be approached along the coast. So inch your way towards the town. Once you get your tanks, use them there. If that motorized SS division is gonna cause you trouble, and this is pretty much the only unit you really need to kill, try to lure it out into the plains and kill it with your air force. And once you reach Bastia, use the naval bombardment you've saved and maybe some airstrikes and take that town. It's not gonna be too difficult at that point. And the Italian infantry will not counterattack. They're pretty passive there, and they will run out of supply. In the subsequent turns, and Porto Vecchio essentially requires one unit and a little bit of patience. Just cut the town off from supply and wait until the defenders run out, and then kill them. You got plenty of time to do that. Now on to Sardinia. After the initial landings, your main objective obviously will be Cagliari, and in these first 4 turns before you get your tanks, clear out the town, remove any counter-attackers between Oristano and Cagliari, and secure your foothold around the Gulf of Oristano on all of its banks. Use your Porto Conte guys to deal as much damage to the enemy as you can, but don't try to break out. And once your tanks are there, push them through the mountains in the eastern parts of the island, eventually blocking the railways between Sassari and Oristano, which will very quickly spell the end of any resistance south of Sassari, at which point you should drive forward along the railway towards Olbia, keeping in mind though that the AI sees the hexes around the town to be high priority and will try to retake them at all costs. So your best approach when getting to Olbia is sending your best tank division into the hex next to it and giving it a counterattack order. Even if you lose that hex, you will deal a good amount of damage to the enemy and be in a better position to push forward on the next turn. The road south and southeast of the town is also an interesting potential route of approach, but its usability depends on the enemy's actions, and I did not find it reliably successful. Good luck. And this is it for today and for this DLC. And I wonder what's coming next in this game. And given that the lead designer for the game has already published a screenshot of a map with the parts of Africa that looks suspiciously like Eastern Egypt, it's reasonable to think we're not leaving Africa for the time being. Cheers.